Every day, promptly at 8 in the morning, a man named James Patterson would enter the corner cafe, a simple yet cozy place where the aroma of fresh coffee seemed to embrace everyone who walked through the door. No one knew much about him except that he always made the same order: 2 cups of coffee. The waiter, Mike Thompson, always watched him. James would sit in the corner, alone, with a distant look in his eyes, as if lost in some far-off thought. He would drink the first cup slowly, savoring every sip, but leave the second cup untouched, perfectly aligned on the table. Every day the same routine. And no one ever asked why. But Mike, a curious young man, couldn't help but wonder. Why 2 cups? Was he waiting for someone? Or was it some tradition he didn't understand? In the following days, Mike began to notice more details. James never seemed to care about the conversations around him, his mind always elsewhere. And over time, Mike realized there was something deeply mysterious about his behavior. The second cup of coffee, always empty, seemed to carry a weight. But what could be so important to James that he repeated this ritual every day without fail? That's when Mike decided he needed to understand what was really going on. He had to know the reason behind the tradition, something that kept him so rooted in that cafe and in that peculiar habit. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for James to share his story, the story he had kept silent for so long. But what Mike didn't know was that this story was about to change everything. The cafe was quiet that morning, with the soft sound of conversations in the background and the espresso machine working relentlessly. James walked in as always and made his usual order: 2 cups of coffee. But this time, Mike was determined to understand what was going on in the mind of the mysterious man. With the tray in his hands, Mike approached James's table, and as he carefully placed the cups on the table, he couldn't resist any longer. He cast a curious glance and with a shy smile said, "James, can I ask you something? Every day you order 2 cups and I've never understood why. Is there a special reason for that?" James slowly raised his eyes. For a moment, Mike thought he wouldn't answer, that the silence would swallow the question. But then, with a deep sigh, James smiled in a melancholic way, as if he had finally found someone willing to listen. And that's when he spoke. "There for her. For Sarah." James's words fell like a silent bomb. Mike didn't know what to expect, but he never imagined that the man he saw every day would carry something so deep and painful. James looked at the second cup, still there, untouched, as if it were waiting for someone. She used to come here with me. We always had coffee together, every morning. But after she left, I still come. Every day. As a way to keep the tradition, as if she were still here with me." Mike was left speechless. The man he had seen as an enigmatic figure was now revealed to be someone with immense and silent pain, a grief that seemed endless. But what Mike didn't know was that this story was far from simple. And that moment, that simple encounter, would be the beginning of a revelation he could never have imagined. Mike felt the weight of the story and, at the same time, a growing need to know more. But before he could ask another question, James was already getting up, taking his second cup and giving it one last look with a bitter smile. "She'll never come back, but I'll keep waiting." And it was in that moment that Mike knew there was something even deeper at play. Something he still couldn't fully understand. And, unwittingly, he was about to become involved in a story that could change everything. In the days that followed, the routine at the corner cafe continued as always. But for Mike, the mornings were never the same. He watched James every day as if each movement of the man had something more behind it. The second cup of coffee, always untouched, always empty, seemed to carry an indescribable weight. James would arrive, place his order, and sit at the corner table, his gaze lost in memories. Each sip of the first cup was taken with an almost ritualistic calm, but when he looked at the second, his eyes grew deep and sad, as if he were waiting for something or someone. But no one ever came. The second cup was never drunk. Mike wondered if James knew he was living in that cycle, in that endless wait. It wasn't just the coffee he drank, it was his entire life, a routine trapped in a memory, in a promise perhaps. But the question that lingered in Mike's mind was, what would happen when that cup was empty for the last time? Mike began to talk more with the cafe's regular customers, trying to learn more about James and the mystery of Sarah. It was then that he learned, from one of his colleagues, that James and Sarah had been married for years, but she had suddenly disappeared without a trace. The police had investigated but never found any answers. Since then, James seemed to live in a shadow, trapped in a past that no one else could reach. James and Sarah's story, although it seemed distant and almost forgotten, was still alive in the man's routine. But what Mike didn't understand was why James hadn't given up. Why continue with the tradition of the second cup, knowing that Sarah would never come back? Every morning, every gesture, seemed to be a sign that he still believed, even without hope. He clung to an invisible thread, waiting for a miracle that would never happen. And then one day Mike noticed something different. When James arrived that morning, something was out of place. The man looked at the second cup, but instead of his usual sad and resigned gaze, there was a glimpse of something else. Something Mike couldn't identify. But for a moment, James seemed to be saying goodbye. It was in that instant that the truth began to form in Mike's mind. What he didn't know was that the answer to James's mystery wasn't just in the empty cups, but in what they represented. And when he finally discovered it, nothing would be the same. Mike felt a chill. He knew he was about to uncover something that would change everything. But exactly what? What was behind that second cup? And what was James truly waiting for? Time was running out for the revelation, and Mike wasn't sure if he was ready for what was about to happen. Mike couldn't stop thinking about James. Every detail of his routine, every silent gesture, seemed to hide something larger. And that day he made a decision. He needed to know the truth. If necessary, he would go all the way. Something told him that James was trapped in a pain that would never be erased, but maybe, just maybe, he could still help understand what had happened to Sarah. That afternoon, Mike did what many in the cafe had avoided. He went to James's house. The small brick house was located on the outskirts of town, on a quiet, almost isolated street. The door was ajar, and Mike hesitated for a moment before knocking softly 3 times. James's voice came from inside, low, almost as if he had been expecting it. "Come in." Mike entered and was met by a heavy silence, the smell of coffee still lingering in the air. The place was simple, but there were old photos in every corner, pictures of a younger man and a smiling woman with long hair and bright eyes. It was Sarah. He recognized her immediately. The woman he never knew enough about. The woman who now loomed over everything. James was sitting at the table as always, a cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't seem surprised, just exhausted, as if he already knew this moment would come. "Do you have any questions, Mike?" James asked in a hoarse voice. Mike looked at him, sitting down in the chair across. His eyes were filled with unanswered questions, but he knew this was the moment. He had to understand. I just want to know what happened. What happened to Sarah?" Mike asked, trying not to sound intrusive but unable to hide the urgency in his voice. James took a deep breath and for a moment remained silent. His eyes wandered to the coffee cup as if he were waiting for something, perhaps an answer, perhaps the right moment to speak. "I promised I would have coffee with her every day," he finally said. "Even after she died. She asked me to do that, Mike. When she was sick, she asked me to never stop doing this as a way to stay by her side. I didn't know what else to do. What else could I do?" Mike fell silent, absorbing the words. He knew the story was much deeper than he had imagined. But there was something more. Something James wasn't saying. "But what happened to her?" Mike insisted. James's face twisted as if the pain were unbearable. He looked at Sarah's photo on the wall, his eyes misty. Sarah didn't disappear, Mike. She died. And the worst part is that I knew she was dying. We knew. But we never had the courage to talk about it. I spent every day trying to deny it. Trying to believe that she would come back. That somehow she would return to me. Mike felt a chill in his stomach. He never imagined the mystery was so deep, so painful. James wasn't trapped in an inexplicable disappearance, but in a brutal loss, in a promise he made to the woman he loved. She asked me to wait, Mike. Wait for her. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it was. I never broke that promise. And I never will. Mike looked at the man in front of him. The pain in James's eyes was palpable. But there was something more there, something Mike was beginning to understand. It wasn't just grief. It was the refusal to accept reality. James was stuck in the past, condemned to a weight that would never end. And somehow, it was becoming a prison not just for him but also for those who watched him. Mike got up from the chair, feeling a mix of compassion and sadness. He didn't know how to console someone trapped in such a deep cycle of pain and denial. But there was one thing he knew for sure. James's past, with all its promises and traumas, wouldn't let him go. And as the waiter looked at the man who drank coffee every morning, he knew that James and Sarah's story was far from over. Somehow James's past was still alive. And he was about to discover that the price of staying trapped in it was much higher than he ever imagined. The next morning, Mike couldn't get James out of his head. Every word spoken in the man's house echoed in his mind, but something didn't add up. Sarah had died, that was clear. But there was something more, something James hadn't revealed. He could feel it. The pain in James's eyes was real, but the way he spoke about the promise, it was as if he were still waiting for something that could never return. What else was behind this story? And why did he feel that there was more, something hidden in the shadows of James's past? In the following days, the waiter observed James from a distance, trying to piece things together. He had started talking to other customers, searching for any clue that might shed light on what had really happened. And it was during a casual conversation with an old friend of James, Robert, that Mike heard something that would change everything. Robert, a man in his 60s, was a cafe regular. He had known James for decades and always seemed to know more than he let on. When Mike asked the direct question, Robert hesitated, but after a long sip of coffee, he spoke in a low voice. "Did you know that Sarah didn't die in the hospital?" He looked around as if making sure no one else was listening. "She died at home in James's bed." Mike froze. That didn't make sense. If Sarah had died at home, why hadn't James talked about it? Why hadn't he mentioned the real circumstances of her death? Mike asked the only question left in his mind. "But what happened? What do you mean by that?" Robert glanced around again before leaning in closer to Mike. "I don't know exactly what happened, Mike, but something was off. No one else knew this, not even Sarah's family, but James always insisted that she was alive in some way. He said she visited him, that she was watching him. When she died, he never accepted it. He didn't believe she was really gone. And I saw it in his eyes. He didn't want to believe she was out of his life." Mike sat in silence, processing what he had just heard. The missing piece, the key to the mystery, was beginning to reveal itself. Something was very wrong with James and Sarah's story. But what exactly? And more importantly, what was James still hiding? He knew he had to go back to James's house. Something inside him told him that there, in the place where it all began and where pain still lingered like a presence, lay the answer. The mystery wasn't just about Sarah. It was about James himself, the way he had clung to an illusion, and what he was willing to do to keep his promise. Mike decided that he wouldn't leave that day without answers. He didn't know what he would find, but one thing was certain. The mystery was deeper than he had ever imagined. And by uncovering it, he might not only reveal the truth about Sarah and James, but also about something much darker that loomed over the house in James's mind. He was about to discover that sometimes, the greatest mystery isn't what we see, but what refuses to be seen. Mike didn't know what to expect when he returned to James's house that afternoon. The town was shrouded in a dense fog, and the air felt heavy, as if even time itself knew that something important was about to happen. He felt like he was on the edge of something that could change everything, but at the same time, doubt gnawed at his mind. What if he was wrong? What if James was just trapped in his grief, creating stories to hold on to Sarah's memory? He knocked on the door, a bit more hesitant than the last time. James, his face weary, invited him in without a word. The silence between them was palpable, thick with a tension Mike couldn't quite explain. "James, I need to know the truth," Mike said, cutting straight to the point. "I know there's more. I've heard things that don't make sense. You need to tell me what really happened to Sarah." James looked at him, his eyes sunken and tired, as if the weight of an entire lifetime was collapsing upon him. He didn't respond immediately but walked into the kitchen and returned with an old, dust-covered box that had been tucked away in the corner of the room. He placed the box on the table and slowly opened it, revealing a collection of objects and documents. This is what I've never shown anyone, Mike," James said, his voice hoarse. "But it's time you knew. You need to understand what happened to Sarah. And what I really did." Inside the box were old photos, letters, a small wooden box, and something Mike couldn't immediately identify. James picked up the wooden box and with trembling hands opened it, revealing a small amulet. It was simple, but its golden gleam seemed out of place in the somber setting. This belonged to Sarah," James began, his voice breaking. "She gave it to me before everything. She told me that when the time came I should wear it. She said that, somehow, it would keep me close to her, that it would give me strength to move on. But I couldn't. I couldn't let her go. And then, when she died, I did something that I don't know if I can live with anymore." Mike, confused and unsure of what to ask next, glanced at the box. But there was a letter inside, one that looked recent, with an address he didn't recognize. He picked it up, but before he could read it, James stopped him. "Don't read that yet," James said, urgency in his voice. The letter came after. What I did with it wasn't right. I shouldn't have done it, Mike. But I did. I searched, I sought out someone to bring Sarah back to me. I didn't want to live without her. And I paid the price for it." Mike was frozen, speechless. James's revelation was beginning to make sense, but the pieces were still jumbled. He didn't understand what James meant by sought out something, or bring Sarah back. How could that even be possible? James, now visibly shaken, looked at Mike with eyes full of guilt and pain. "I found someone, Mike. Someone who claimed to have the power to bring the dead back." I didn't believe it, but the grief was unbearable, and Sarah's promise still lingered in my mind. I went there and I did something. And when I came back, I thought she was back. But she wasn't. It wasn't her. It was something much worse. Something I didn't know how to control. Mike's heart pounded. James's words were tumbling out frantically, as if he could no longer hold back the weight of the truth. Something James had done, something he believed was a way to bring Sarah back, had gone terribly wrong. But what exactly had happened? What had James done? Mike looked down at the letter in his trembling hands and finally read the words, written in an elegant but urgent script. "You know what must be done. The power you seek comes at a price. Do not expect the truth to bring comfort." Mike lifted his gaze, a growing sense of dread creeping into his chest. He knew he was dealing with something far greater than James's grief. Something that went beyond loss and plunged into an abyss of the unknown. James hadn't just lost Sarah. He had lost her in a much darker way, and his search for answers had led him to a place no one should ever go. But what James didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. What he had unleashed in his attempt to bring Sarah back, that Mike would soon realize, was only the beginning of the end. The silence in the room was deafening. Mike still held the letter, the elegant yet cold handwriting making his mind spin in search of answers. But even so, he knew he was far from understanding the full depth of James's story. He felt an unsettling sensation, as if he were staring into the abyss and yet wanted more. He wanted to know what James had done, what he was hiding, and how it was all connected to Sarah's fate. James, seemingly exhausted, began to speak again, his words dragging out as if each one carried an immense weight. He stared intently at the amulet on the table, the lamp's light reflecting off it, and finally revealed what had so far seemed unthinkable. I went to a medium. He claimed to have the power to bring the dead back. He had a way to communicate with the beyond, to reverse death. I didn't know what to do, Mike. I wanted Sarah back. I couldn't accept the idea of living without her. And that man, he told me he could do it. He said he only needed a sacrifice. Something of great value, something that would be enough to open the portal. A chill ran down Mike's spine. The idea of a sacrifice already sent his mind reeling with dread. He knew James wasn't talking about something simple, but about a far greater price. However, what came next left Mike speechless. I didn't know, Mike. I didn't know that what I did, that what I asked for, would have such terrible consequences. After the ceremony, when I came back, I thought Sarah was there, sitting at the table waiting for me. But it wasn't her. It was something that looked like her, but it wasn't her. And then I started to realize. She hadn't returned. Something much darker had been brought back. Mike blinked, unable to process what he had just heard. He stared at James, trying to understand, but nothing made sense. How was this possible? What was James saying? He had summoned something, but what he had brought back wasn't Sarah? Was it a spirit, a presence, something else? I saw her eyes, Mike. The same eyes, but empty. The smile, but cold, lifeless. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't take it back. I didn't want to see it, but it was there, and she kept telling me she had come back for me. When she touched me, I felt the void. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger she became. Until one night, she told me something that I will never forget. Mike was tense, absorbing every word. James was sinking further into his own lies, into his desperate attempt to justify his actions. And at that moment, Mike realized the truth was even more terrifying than he had imagined. She told me, Mike, that Sarah's soul had been consumed. That what was there in that body was no longer the woman I loved. It was something that had taken her place. Something that should never have been in this world. Mike swallowed hard. James's words were as absurd as they were horrifying. What had he done? What had he unleashed in his attempt to bring Sarah back? James was trapped in a lie that had now turned into a real nightmare. And the worst part was that he seemed completely blind to what had truly happened. He still believed that Sarah was somehow there, waiting for him. I tried to save her, but the more time passed, the more I realized there was nothing left. There was no love, no life. I was alone, Mike. And that thing was getting stronger, more dangerous. And I didn't know how to stop it. With every word James spoke, the anguish grew inside Mike. He felt an increasing fear, a sense that something terrible was about to happen, something beyond his control. He knew James had gone too far. He had done something unthinkable, something that should never have been done. James, his eyes welling with tears, looked at Mike as if begging for help, as if he still believed someone could fix what he had broken. I didn't know, Mike. I just wanted Sarah back. I just wanted her by my side. But now, I'm starting to see what I really brought back. And it's not just her anymore. Mike didn't know how to react. The truth was more terrifying than any horror story he had ever heard. James hadn't just lost Sarah. He had lost her forever by trying to bring her back in a way that defied the laws of nature. What he had brought back wasn't a spirit, but a malevolent entity, something that should never have been summoned. And that, Mike knew, was about to destroy not just James, but everyone around him. James was beginning to lose control, and the worst was yet to come. He had unleashed something far darker than he could have ever imagined. And now the question was, how far could this go? Time felt distorted that morning. The cafe was emptier than ever, a heavy fog covering the streets, carrying the eerie sensation that something was about to happen, something no one could stop. Mike felt the pressure mounting with each passing second. What he had learned about James, the desperate attempt to bring Sarah back, it all felt like a spiraling descent into madness. And yet, he knew the final moment was approaching. The conclusion was about to unfold. James looked more fragile than ever. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were now lost, as if he were grasping for something that had long since slipped away. He sat at the cafe table, staring at the cup in front of him. But what lay before him was not just a simple cup of coffee. It was the last link, the final attempt to hold on to some sense of normalcy in a world he had shattered with his own hands. Mike sat across from him, the weight of the situation hanging between them. He looked at the coffee James had ordered, the second cup that always came with the first, a tradition he had never abandoned even after everything that had happened. But now, that simple gesture seemed to carry the weight of eternity. "James, what are you going to do now?" Mike asked, his voice low but filled with an urgency that could not be ignored. "You know you can't keep going like this. What you did, what you unleashed, it's growing. You're not in control anymore." James kept his gaze fixed on the coffee cup, offering no immediate response. He seemed lost in thought, searching for a way out of the chaos he had created. "I don't know what to do, Mike," James finally answered, his voice hoarse as if each word was a struggle. "I thought that if I could bring her back, everything would be okay. But the more I tried, the more I see how wrong I was. I didn't bring Sarah back. I brought something worse. Something that can't be controlled. Something that's spreading, and now I think the darkness has spread through me too." The tension in the air was palpable. Mike felt a knot tightening in his throat. He knew what James was saying. The entity he had summoned wasn't just a physical presence. It was corrupting everything around him, taking form, feeding off James's own pain and despair. And worse, it was getting stronger. But there was something else Mike couldn't ignore. James was broken, but he still clung to hope, to the belief that there was a way to fix what had been done. He believed there was an escape, a way to undo his mistake. But Mike knew, as hard as it was to admit, that there was no turning back. James had crossed a line that could never be erased. What he had done could not be undone. "James, there's no way back," Mike said, sorrow in his voice. "I know you tried, but what's happened, there's no fixing this. What you brought back, what you unleashed, it's going to destroy everything." James looked at Mike, his eyes now filled with despair. He finally understood what Mike was saying, but that didn't make the pain go away. Nothing could bring Sarah back. And the shadow he had unleashed would not be banished so easily. Then a low, almost imperceptible sound began to spread through the room, like a distant vibration, a wave moving slowly. Mike froze for a moment, feeling the pressure intensify. It was as if something was happening, something beyond their understanding. And then, when James turned to look at the door, the cruel truth finally revealed itself. The cafe door opened and a dark figure entered. Its face was impossible to see, but the freezing air that accompanied it seemed to cut through reality itself. The entity James had summoned was there, standing before them, a shadow stretching over everything they had known. The cafe, once a place of refuge, was now drenched in palpable fear. Mike knew there was no escape. James was paralyzed. He knew what stood before him. He had brought it into his life, into his town, into the very cafe where he had sought solace for years. He had unleashed something beyond his control, and now everything was about to be destroyed. Mike, seeing the sheer terror on James's face, knew the moment had come. The last coffee James had ordered wasn't just a drink. It was a final attempt to find peace in a world shattered by his own choices. But now the entity had come to collect its price. Silence filled the room, not through words but through a presence that consumed everything. The last coffee, the final tradition, had become the final witness to a story of despair. James looked at Mike one last time, his eyes filled with guilt and pain. And then the shadow took over, enveloping everything, and the cafe fell silent once more. The price had been paid, and the darkness had finally found its place. And in that moment, Mike knew that James's story, the tragedy he had set in motion, had come to its end. But the echo of what had happened there in the heart of the cafe would be something no one would ever forget. The next morning arrived without ceremony. The sun, still timid, barely managed to pierce through the thick fog enveloping the city. The cafe was empty, with scattered tables and vacant chairs, as if time itself had paused. Mike found himself once again in front of the old cup of coffee, but this time, it wasn't just the coffee that kept him there. He knew he had to face the last part of this story, the remnants of what was left after the darkness. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that life would go on. He looked at the clock as if waiting for something, and then he felt James's presence beside him. But it wasn't the James he had known. It wasn't the broken man, lost in his own abyss of regret. It was someone different. His expression was peaceful now, as if he had finally understood what he needed to do. Mike looked at him, his eyes still heavy with pain but also with a quiet sense of relief. Something inside him knew that, in some way, this was a farewell. You're leaving, aren't you? Mike asked, his voice softer but filled with silent understanding. James didn't answer immediately. He was staring into the distance as if weighing his words. He glanced at the cup of coffee in front of him, still untouched, and sighed. I know I made the wrong choices. I know there's no way to undo them. But Mike, I can't stay here anymore. I can't keep living in this nightmare. I tried to fight, tried to find a way to make things right, but now, there's only one thing left for me to do. I have to let it all go. I need you to understand that, in the end, love can't be forced. And that's what I did. I forced what was never meant to be forced. That is something I will carry with me until the end. Mike felt the weight of James's words. The internal battle he had fought, the burden of his choices, was now about to dissipate. And with that, he knew that this was not just a farewell to James, but to an entire chapter of their lives, a chapter marked by darkness and suffering. James rose slowly, as if even gravity hesitated to let him go. He looked at Mike one last time, a sad, heavy smile forming on his lips. I never expected forgiveness, Mike. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself, but maybe the only way to find some peace now is to move on. For me, for Sarah, for all of us. Mike felt the weight of those words. He knew James was leaving, but he didn't know if that meant the story was finally over or if something would still linger in the shadows. But at that moment he understood that, in some way, true strength lay in acceptance. Acceptance that, no matter how much we try to fix what is already broken, life goes on. James took a step toward the door, but before leaving he turned to Mike one last time. The look in his eyes now was one of freedom. He had freed himself from the pain, the guilt, the obsession with the past. Take care of yourself, Mike. And please don't hold on to what can't be changed. The past never comes back and not everything can be fixed. Sometimes the best we can do is move forward. No matter how long it takes. Mike didn't say a word. He just watched as James disappeared through the cafe door. Something inside him knew that, although the pain was still there, he was also beginning to feel free. The shadow James had brought into their lives was finally starting to fade. The weight of what they had been through was still heavy, but James's departure seemed in some way to bring a sense of closure. Outside, the city was still wrapped in fog, but the feeling of being trapped in it had begun to lift, as if the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. Mike took a deep breath, feeling ready to move forward. No longer bound to the past. No longer held by the pain James had inflicted upon himself and others. He picked up the coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. It was empty, but somehow that felt right. The cycle had ended. He knew that, from this moment on, a new beginning lay ahead of him as well. With a deep sigh, Mike rose from the table and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he looked around at the empty cafe, now filled with a sense of renewal and freedom. He knew that life would go on. And perhaps in time he too would find his peace. And so, the last cup of coffee was finished, the final farewell given. But contrary to what many might think, this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The beginning of a new journey where, at last, the sun had begun to shine. Hey everyone, we've reached the end of another journey, and as always, this moment feels like it deserves something special. Every chapter of this story was filled with emotion, twists, and, of course, that touch of mystery we all love. But before we wrap things up, I just want to take a moment to thank you for being here, following every detail, every turn in the plot. If you enjoyed this story, if it made you feel something, you already know what to do, right? Don't forget to leave a like, Drop a comment below letting me know what you thought of the ending, and of course subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because trust me, the next story is going to surprise you even more. And I want to hear from you. What did you think of this ending? Do you think James made the right choice? What do you think the future holds for Mike? Tell me everything in the comments. Let's talk. Every opinion matters and it helps shape what's coming next. Remember, there are always more stories waiting to be told, more mysteries to unravel, and more hearts to touch. And you, my friend, are a part of it all. So, until the next video where another emotional and unforgettable tale will make you feel everything all over again. Stay tuned, and until then, keep believing in the stories that can change your day. See you soon. Watch the next video. Who knows, the next story might be even more intense, if you dare to keep going.